The date is July 24th, 1914. In the dim corridors of the Austrian Ministry of Finance, clerks move with an urgency that betrays the calm facade of empire. The lamps burn low, casting long shadows over ledgers stacked higher than the men who keep them. Ink dries on documents that will never see public eyes. Messages arrive from Vienna's central bank, each one darker than the last. Gold reserves, once the pride of the Habsburg treasury, are draining faster than they can be counted. Overnight, foreign creditors begin whispering, testing whether the empire can still meet its obligations. Newspapers speak of diplomacy and ultimatums, but inside these walls the fear is quieter, colder, and immeasurably more dangerous. Insolvency. Outside, carriages rattle across cobblestones slick with summer rain, carrying ministers who pretend the real crisis is Serbia's defiance. Yet every one of them knows the truth they dare not articulate. The ultimatum they crafted is not merely about national honor. It is a financial gamble. If Serbia resists, Austria-Hungary marches. And if Austria-Hungary marches, it must borrow heavily. There, in that moment, war becomes more than strategy. It becomes liquidity. Across the continent, every government senses the tremor. Every bank does too. Far from Vienna, in the counting rooms of Berlin, London, and Paris, the same anxiety coils like smoke. Europe's great powers stand as colossi, built not on secure foundations, but on credit, vast, intricate, and brittle. These empires swagger across continents, drawing borders with the confidence of gods, yet their balance sheets tell a different story. Deficits, widening gold shipments, slowing colonial revenues, underperforming, and foreign banks holding leverage over governments like puppeteers with taut strings. To understand the world of 1914 is to understand a civilization that believed it was at its zenith, unaware that its prosperity had become a trap. In London, clerks in the Bank of England track bullion shipments from South Africa with the precision of surgeons. Every ounce matters. The British Empire, draped in the illusion of infinite wealth, depends on the constant inflow of colonial gold to sustain its currency and keep global finance anchored. Its admirals boast of ruling the seas, but the city S-bankers rule something far more consequential: the flows of capital that determine which nations stand and which collapse. In Paris, credit houses pore over Algerian tax receipts and Indochinese export logs, calculating how many months the Republic can hold its global position before needing yet another external loan. And in Berlin, young, industrial, ambitious, the Reichstag debates naval bills that cost more in gold than the empire possesses. Every mark spent expanding the Kaiser's fleet drains the vaults further. Every tariff dispute with Britain pushes foreign investors to reconsider whether German bonds are truly safe. Behind the fiery speeches and patriotic proclamations lies a quiet dread, the fear that a single shock could topple the financial scaffolding holding the empire aloft. This is the world as it was on the eve of war, a continent outwardly confident, inwardly strained. But the tension did not arise suddenly. Decades of imperial expansion had created an economic rivalry so severe that no nation could afford to fall behind. Empires conquered not merely for glory, but for solvency. Colonies served as collateral. Armies protected revenue streams masquerading as territories. Competition for markets became inseparable from competition for political dominance, and the gold standard, rigid, unforgiving, made the entire system as fragile as glass. By the summer of 1914, that glass was cracking. The assassination in Sarajevo would become the convenient story, the dramatic spark retold in classrooms and documentaries for generations. A pistol, a parade, a wounded heir. But the bullet did not rupture Europe's peace. It merely struck a continent already hollowed out by financial strain. The true fuse lay hidden in the ledgers of ministries, in the correspondence between banks, in the desperate tone of ministers pleading for credit from foreign lenders who stood to gain regardless of which side prevailed. It was finance that made July 1914 combustible. As Austria-Hungary drafted its ultimatum, bankers from London to New York watched with a focus unmatched by politicians. War meant risk, yes, but also unprecedented opportunity. Loans to mobilize armies, credit lines to fund supply chains, emergency bonds to stabilize collapsing currencies. For decades, a handful of financial houses had attached themselves to the arteries of empire. Now, those arteries were beginning to pulse with the fever of crisis, and in that fever, profit could be drawn like blood. Across the Atlantic, Wall Street's titans monitored events with the dispassionate precision of men accustomed to turning turmoil into advantage. Neutrality, to them, was merely another variable on a balance sheet. What mattered was exposure, who owed what, and to whom. The inevitability of conflict was not debated, but calculated, and the numbers told a story far removed from the one diplomats repeated publicly. Whichever alliance secured credit would survive. Whichever failed would collapse before its armies ever reached the front. Back in Vienna, as midnight approaches on that same July night, a clerk closes a ledger and locks it away. Its entries reveal an empire stretched to breaking, an empire that cannot wage war without borrowing from banks already entangled with its enemies. Yet, the decision has been made. Mobilization orders wait in sealed envelopes. Generals prepare schedules, railway lines are cleared, and ministers whisper assurances they do not believe. War looms not as a choice, but as an accounting. In the silence of those hallways, beneath the flicker of dying lamps, one truth becomes impossible to ignore. Europe is about to ignite, not because of a single assassination, nor because of ancient rivalries, but because its financial machinery has reached a point where peace is more expensive than conflict. The gold that once anchored stability now chains empires to the edge of catastrophe. Every bond issued, every loan deferred, every shipment of bullion delayed has led to this precipice, and as the continent stands poised to fall, the forces truly pulling it toward the abyss are not soldiers or statesmen, but the unseen architects of its credit. The lamps in Vienna's ministries are only one part of the story. To see how the continent reached this point, the frame has to widen, back over the previous decades, across maps redrawn, not with ideals, but with balance sheets. By the late 19th century, the great European powers had turned empire into an economic machine built to feed capital back to their cores. Flags were planted in distant soil, but behind every expedition and annexation stood a quieter motive: revenue. Colonies were expected to supply cheap raw materials, steady tax streams, and captive markets for manufactured goods. When those expectations faltered, the shortfall did not simply inconvenience governments. It rippled through the very banks that had underwritten their expansion. Britain provides the clearest example. From Cairo to Calcutta and the goldfields of South Africa, British influence rested on more than military presence. It rested on credit. The City of London functioned as the world's clearinghouse, discounting bills of exchange, insuring cargoes, and issuing loans to sovereign borrowers on almost every continent. British investors bought bonds that financed Egyptian irrigation projects, Indian railways, and African mines. In return, they expected punctual interest payments backed by colonial tax receipts and customs duties. When those flows threatened to dry up, the imperial government stepped in, not as a benevolent overseer, but as a guarantor of income. And gunboats, but in coupons clipped at kitchen tables in Manchester and Birmingham. France followed a similar path with its own particular risks. Credit institutions poured funds into colonial infrastructure, rail lines pushing inland, ports modernized to handle exports of rubber, phosphates, and rice. And Russian empires, secured by elaborate debt administrations that gave creditors direct control over customs houses and monopolies. On paper, it looked elegant, high yields, and impressive influence. In reality, it tied French prosperity to the stability of some of the most brittle regimes in the world, so that a strike in a Russian factory or unrest in a Levantine port could reverberate through the boulevards of Paris as a tremor in the bond market. Shipyards along the North Sea hammered out dreadnought hulls. Surveyors traced routes through Anatolian valleys. All of it required capital. Some came from domestic savings. Much came from a network of banks that floated bonds. French investors snapped up Russian bonds, drawn by the promise of generous interest and the aura of great power status. Each mile of track laid across the Russian steppe, each artillery piece purchased for the Tsar's armies, bore the imprint of Parisian capital. In return, Russia accepted a degree of dependence that would later constrain its choices. A government that owes billions to foreign creditors cannot easily ignore their preferences. Austria-Hungary, too, was an empire of borrowed time and borrowed money. Its mosaic of nationalities required constant management and costly concessions. Railways in the Balkans, subsidies to restless provinces, the maintenance of a large standing army, all demanded funds the Habsburg treasury did not fully possess. Loans filled the gap, papering over structural weakness with temporary liquidity. Above these empires hovered the merchant banks that linked them. In London, houses like Rothschild and Baring. In Paris, their continental counterparts. In New York, the rising power of J.P. Morgan. Their offices did not resemble battlefields, yet decisions made in these discreet rooms shaped the fate of states. Partners sat at long tables, examining cables from ambassadors and branch offices, weighing whether to join a new loan, whether to roll over an old one, whether to quietly begin selling a government's bonds. Cigarette smoke hung in the air, telephone lines crackled, clerks stamped coupons and entered figures in neat script. There were no grand speeches, no marching bands, only the relentless arithmetic of profit and risk. For these banks, conflict between borrower states was both danger and opportunity. War endangered repayments, disrupted trade, and risked defaults. But it also generated extraordinary demand for credit as governments scrambled to finance mobilizations, armaments, and emergency imports. As long as a lender could correctly guess the winning side or spread its bets across rivals, the potential returns were immense. By the early 20th century, several major houses had long experience in this balancing act, having financed opposing governments in previous conflicts while presenting themselves to the public as sober, apolitical institutions. The fragility of the system became evident well before 1914. In 1890, The near collapse of Baring Brothers after reckless investments in Argentine debt sent a shockwave through London. For a brief period, the city that underpinned global finance faced the possibility of systemic failure. Only a coordinated rescue, organized by the Bank of England and supported by other major houses, prevented disaster. The episode revealed how tightly connected the world ES credit system had become. A crisis originating in South America threatened savings and institutions in Europe. It also proved that private banks now existed on a scale where their misjudgments could imperil states, not the other way around. Within this environment, imperial competition took on a sharper edge. When Britain worried about German influence in the Ottoman Empire, it was not only concerned about railway lines and naval bases, it was concerned about who would control customs revenues, who would earn interest on loans, who would gain the right to supervise new concessions. When France pressed its position in Morocco, the stakes included not only diplomatic prestige but mineral rights, port contracts, and financial privileges. Each international crisis reverberated immediately through bond markets and currency exchanges. The headlines spoke of honor and national interest. The ledgers translated those abstractions into columns of figures, rising or falling with each rumor of war or peace. For governments trapped inside this structure, the consequences were suffocating. Falling behind an imperial rival did not simply mean accepting a lesser place in diplomatic ceremony. It meant risking capital flight, credit downgrades, and domestic unrest as unemployment rose and prices spiked. Leaders who hesitated to arm could be accused not just of weakness, but of endangering the nation's solvency. Political leaders boasted of prosperity and stability, but beneath the rhetoric lay an awareness that everything depended on the uninterrupted flow of gold and credit. Russia Ichioesi's decision to back Serbia came from a state whose finances were deeply entangled with French bankers. Every step taken in that fateful July was shaped, overtly or subtly, by the awareness that credit lines might close, that investors might flee, that currencies might crack under the strain of uncertainty. The public heard speeches about loyalty to allies and the defense of civilization. Behind closed doors, ministers discussed how long they could sustain war without exhausting reserves, what collateral they could offer for emergency loans, which foreign financiers might still be persuaded to extend credit if the conflict dragged on. The decision-makers of 1914 walked a narrow ridge between bankruptcy and catastrophe, and in the end, they chose a path that delivered both. To understand why each decision in that chain became so rigid, why caution gave way to acceleration instead of retreat, the story must turn to the mechanism that bound these empires together and trapped them at the same time: the gold standard. On the surface, it appeared to be the pinnacle of financial order. Each major currency, pounds, francs, marks, rubles, was tied to a fixed quantity of gold. This arrangement promised stability. A merchant in Hamburg could accept a bill drawn in London, confident that it represented a real claim on bullion. A banker in Paris could buy Russian bonds, knowing the Tsar's government had pledged to maintain convertibility. It was a world arranged around a metal, a system that convinced its participants that so long as gold flowed, civilization was secure. Beneath that polished ideal lay a harsh reality. Gold is finite. It must be mined, transported, guarded. When a nation ran persistent trade deficits, importing more than it exported, gold left its vaults. When a panic struck and investors demanded safety, they rushed to convert paper into metal, draining central bank reserves. To defend their currencies, governments raised interest rates, making borrowing more expensive and credit scarcer. What looked like prudence on a balance sheet translated, in ordinary life, into shuttered factories, rising unemployment, and household budgets stretched to breaking. Monetary discipline was paid for in human anxiety. In 1914, Britain held an enormous share of the world's monetary gold, much of it channeled from colonial mines in South Africa and beyond. London's dominance in trade and finance meant that other countries depended on its willingness to keep capital moving. Germany, despite its industrial strength, lacked comparable reserves. Years of naval expansion and ambitious projects strained its capacity. Behind the speeches about dignity on the seas and the right to a place in the sun, there was a more prosaic problem. The Reichsbank's vaults were not overflowing. Each crisis, each spike in tension with Britain or France risked capital flight. Foreign investors, worried that war might make German bonds hard to redeem, shifted funds elsewhere. Gold trickled outward. These movements were not theoretical exercises in economics. When reserves fell and interest rates rose, the effects reached directly into daily life. A baker in Berlin found it harder to renew a loan to buy flour. A small manufacturer in the Rhineland struggled to finance new equipment. Municipalities postponed projects. In the countryside, farmers who had borrowed to modernize their land suddenly faced higher payments. All of this fed a sense of vulnerability, a feeling that Germany was being squeezed not only on the oceans, but in the invisible realm of finance where Britain's long-established prestige gave it an advantage. The gold standard, in this way, turned diplomacy into a high-stakes game with very little room for miscalculation. Each confrontation, over Morocco, over the Balkans, over naval parity, sent ripples through money markets. During the Agadir crisis of 1911, when German and French forces nearly clashed over influence in Morocco, gold began to shift rapidly. Banks tightened credit, uncertain whether they were witnessing a passing storm or the prelude to catastrophe. To lure gold back, central banks lifted interest rates, deliberately slowing their domestic economies in the name of defending their currencies. Tension in North Africa translated into layoffs in factories thousands of kilometers away, reinforcing the belief that geopolitical retreat was impossible. Too much had already been sacrificed to maintain the struggle. As the pressures mounted, states turned to a tool they believed might reduce uncertainty: alliances. In schoolbooks, these are often described as simple agreements of mutual defense. In practice, they were intricate, often secret covenants with financial implications threaded through their clauses. The dual alliance between Germany and Austria-Hungary, the Franco-Russian alliance, the later Triple Entente, all were supposed to reassure investors that their signatories would not stand alone. Yet they also created rigid chains of obligation that limited each government's freedom to de-escalate. For a state heavily indebted to a foreign partner, breaking an alliance could mean not only political isolation, but a sudden refusal of further credit. Some of the most revealing documents of this period were not grand treaties announced from balconies. but confidential arrangements that blurred the line between diplomacy and finance. The reinsurance treaty, negotiated by Bismarck with Russia in the late 1880s, promised neutrality under specific conditions, but its existence was concealed, in part to avoid unsettling Austria-Hungary and the markets that watched for signs of shifting commitments. Later, in 1915, the Treaty of London would bring Italy over to the side of the Entente, with promises of territory carved from Austria-Hungary, and crucially, financial support. Loan packages, credit facilities, and future shares of reparations were woven into the bargain. It was not only land being allocated, it was anticipated income. Elsewhere, agreements such as the Sykes-Picot understanding between Britain and France mapped out not only zones of political influence in the collapsing Ottoman Empire, but future control over resources, especially oil. These plans assumed victory and imagined a world where banks in London and Paris would have first claim on the profits extracted from reconfigured territories. The negotiations took place while soldiers were still dying by the thousands along the Western Front. The front line and the boardroom were separated by distance and language, but not by purpose. The war was already being treated as an investment that would need to yield returns. No relationship better illustrates the fusion of alliance and finance than that between Germany and Austria-Hungary. As the Habsburg monarchy stumbled under the weight of internal division and economic weakness, Berlin stepped in as lender of last resort. Over the course of the war, German banks would come to hold a dominant share of Austrian debt. On one level, this support kept a crucial ally fighting. On another, it allowed Germany to siphon off Austrian gold and exert increasing control over its policy. Vienna's autonomy shrank as its liabilities grew. What looked like solidarity in public communique resembled parasitic dependence in the ledgers. By the midpoint of the war, clerks in Austrian ministries could watch the transformation in numbers alone. Gold shipments to Berlin recorded with crisp entries. New credits extended with stern conditions. Each transfer tightened the knot further. The empire was no longer merely a partner in arms. It had become collateral. Across the Atlantic, a different kind of transformation was underway. When the war began in 1914, the United States declared neutrality. Officially, it would not take sides. Its factories, however, were another matter. European armies needed rifles, shells, foodstuffs, locomotives, telegraph wire, trucks, an entire supply chain of modern war, and American industry was uniquely positioned to provide them. Yet production on that scale required finance. Someone had to pay the mills and shipyards, preferably in advance. This is where a single name enters the story with unusual force: J.P. Morgan, Jr. At the head of a powerful Wall Street house with deep ties to London, Morgan recognized not only the humanitarian catastrophe unfolding abroad, but the unprecedented financial opportunity it presented. If the Allies could be supplied on credit, using American capital and industrial capacity, then his firm could stand at the center of a web binding together New York, London, and Paris. Over the course of the conflict's early years, Morgan's firm became, in effect, the purchasing agent for the Allied governments in the United States. Contracts worth billions in modern terms flowed through its offices. The sums involved were staggering for the time. One loan, in 1915, arranged to support Britain and France, reached a scale the world had never seen in a foreign bond issue. Subscriptions were taken from American investors, who were told they were both earning a return and assisting civilization in its hour of need. Beneath the patriotic appeals lay a hard strategic logic. The health of the American financial system would be linked to the outcome of the war. As the conflict ground on and the cost in men and material soared, the Allies' dependence on such loans deepened. Gold reserves dwindled, overseas investments were liquidated, taxation increased, but it could not match the relentless pace of expenditure. By 1916, the British government had mortgaged much of its future revenue to maintain the struggle. France, bleeding on the Western Front, leaned on external credit to sustain both its army and its civilian population. Each new borrowing round tied them closer to their creditors, especially in New York. In Berlin, policymakers understood what was happening. They sought alternative channels of support. Gold shipments from allies, emergency measures to control domestic resources, improvisations to keep the war machine functioning. Yet they could not match the combined industrial and financial weight assembling on the other side of the Atlantic. For Germany and its partners, the gold standard gradually became unworkable. To avoid complete collapse, central banks began to sidestep the very rules that had been treated as sacred only a few years earlier, suspending convertibility and issuing paper money in volumes no one had previously dared. What emerged by the later stages of the war was a new phase of financial conflict in which the old constraints were abandoned. Governments no longer pretended that each banknote was a simple claim on metal in a vault. Instead, they treated money as a tool to extract resources from their societies for the front lines, pushing the cost of that extraction into an uncertain future. The age of strict gold discipline was ending, replaced by something more flexible and more dangerous. At this point, war was no longer merely being financed by existing wealth. It was being financed by promises, by debts that would outlive many of the men in uniform. Bonds were sold as patriotic duties, purchased by families who believed they were safeguarding their countries and their children. Posters urged citizens to lend to the state. The slogans spoke of honor and sacrifice. The fine print described interest rates and maturities. While shells exploded over Flanders and Galicia, an intricate lattice of obligations was being constructed far behind the lines, one that would shape the post-war world long after the guns fell silent. When the guns finally began to fall silent in late 1918, it might have seemed, from the trenches and shattered towns, that the great ordeal was ending. Soldiers emerged from dugouts into landscapes torn beyond recognition, believing they had survived the worst that history could inflict on them. Yet in the quieter spaces of ministries and banks, another, less visible reckoning was beginning. The war had not simply consumed lives, it had consumed balance sheets. States had borrowed on a scale the pre-war generation could scarcely have imagined. Gold reserves were depleted, currencies distorted, and entire societies were now bound to obligations written during the most desperate months of the conflict. The war was over, but the debts remained, and in many ways they were just beginning to exert their full power. The peace conference at Versailles is often remembered for its grand symbolism: redrawn borders, new nations, empires dissolved. But beneath the rhetoric of self-determination and justice, financial calculations dominated the proceedings. The victors sought reparations from Germany, not merely as moral compensation, but as a means to service their own obligations. Britain and France had emerged with immense burdens owed to their creditors, especially in the United States. If Germany could be made to pay, those payments could help keep the post-war financial structure standing. The question, debated in committees and late-night sessions, was not whether punishment was appropriate. It was how much the defeated state could be pushed without collapsing entirely. The figures proposed and argued over at Versailles were astronomical for their time. They were framed as a way to make the aggressor pay for the war, but the chain of payment was more complex. For Germany to send gold or foreign currency abroad, it had to earn it through exports or foreign loans. To generate those exports, German industry needed stability, access to raw materials, and credit. Yet the very reparation schedule imposed on the country undermined that stability. As Berlin struggled to keep up with transfers, its domestic finances came under increasing strain. Taxation rose, social tensions sharpened, and political factions used the burden of reparations as a rallying cry. Inside the Reichsbank and the Finance Ministry, officials faced a dilemma: honor external commitments and risk internal breakdown, or loosen monetary discipline and hope that inflation would erode the real weight of the obligations. For a time, they attempted a balancing act, but as the 1920s unfolded, the pressures intensified. The occupation of the Ruhr by French and Belgian troops in response to alleged German defaults further disrupted production. In retaliation, Berlin encouraged passive resistance, paying striking workers with funds created largely by the printing press. What had begun as a strategy of delay and protest soon spiraled into something far more destructive. The world now knows the outcome by a single phrase: hyperinflation. Banknotes printed in ever larger denominations, prices rising so fast that wages paid in the morning lost much of their value by evening. Savings accumulated over lifetimes wiped out in months. Photographs from the period show citizens pushing wheelbarrows of paper currency to buy basic goods, children playing with bundles of notes that no longer represented meaningful wealth. The German middle class, which had purchased war bonds in the belief that they were contributing to national defense and securing their families' futures, found itself dispossessed. The state had survived the war. Many of its citizens' financial foundations had not. This catastrophe was not a natural disaster. It was the delayed consequence of decisions made years earlier, when governments chose to finance total war through massive borrowing rather than immediate taxation. International financiers, too, played their role, arranging new loans, restructuring old ones, searching for formulas that might restore stability while preserving the claims of creditors. Plans like the Dawes and Young arrangements attempted to smooth the reparations burden and bring American capital into Europe as a stabilizing force. For a time, they seemed to succeed. German cities hummed with construction, currencies steadied, the illusion of normalcy returned, yet the underlying structure remained fragile. The prosperity of the late 1920s depended on a continuous flow of funds from New York to Europe, on the willingness of investors to believe that the new order would last. When confidence cracked during the global financial crisis at the decade's end, those flows reversed. Loans were called in, credit contracted, and the delicate balance laboriously assembled after Versailles collapsed. Unemployment soared, political extremism surged, and the resentments incubated by war, debt, and inflation crystallized into movements that rejected the entire international framework. The path from financial architecture to political catastrophe became undeniable. Looking back across this arc, from the pre-war scramble for colonies financed by metropolitan banks through the rigid gold standard that turned crises into existential threats, through wartime borrowing that mortgaged entire societies to the punitive peace and its aftermath, a pattern emerges. It is tempting to narrate World War I as a story of diplomatic failures, military miscalculations, and ideological clashes. Those elements are real, but beneath them lies a deeper continuity, the relentless logic of a financial system that made war both possible and, in the eyes of some decision-makers, necessary. In 1914, empires hesitated to back down, not only because of pride or fear of humiliation, but because their economic models left them little room to accept disadvantage. In 1915 and 1916, neutral powers found themselves drawn in not only by moral sentiment or strategic calculation, but by the sheer scale of financial exposure their elites had accumulated to one side of the conflict. In 1918 and 1919, the victors insisted on payments not solely out of vengeance, but out of a very practical need to service their own obligations to bondholders and banks. Each step along the way, ledger entries nudged states toward decisions that millions would experience only as orders, shortages, or sudden changes in the value of money. The men in smoke-filled rooms who arranged the loans and credit lines of this era did not command armies. They did not stand in trenches or charge across no man's land. Many of them likely believed they were acting prudently, even responsibly, sustaining governments, maintaining confidence, preventing immediate collapse. Yet the cumulative effect of their actions was to construct a world in which entire nations became instruments for defending the interests encoded in those contracts. The price was measured in shells and barbed wire, in ruined cities and uprooted lives. This is not to say that bankers alone caused World War I. History resists such simplifications. Political ambitions, national myths, personal rivalries, and genuine fears all played their part. But to ignore the financial dimension is to miss the framework within which those forces operated. Capital set the boundaries of what leaders believed they could risk, and more ominously, what they believed they could not afford to avoid. The Sarajevo gunshot was the catalyst. The deeper explosion occurred in a system primed by decades of debt, gold, and competition for economic survival. Today, the mechanisms have changed in form, but not entirely in essence. Gold has largely ceded its place to fiat currencies and digital entries. Empires have been replaced by blocks and institutions, yet in moments of crisis, the pattern recurs. Sanctions strangling economies, bailouts conditioned on domestic austerity, conflicts justified in the language of security but entangled with access to resources, markets, and strategic infrastructure. Decisions made in ministries and central banks still reverberate outward, shaping the lives of people far removed from the rooms where those decisions are taken. When we reflect on World War I as the war to end all wars, it is worth remembering that it also marked the birth of a fully modern financial order, one in which the scale of mobilization, destruction, and reconstruction would be measured not only in casualties, but in columns of numbers stretching across continents. The trenches have long since filled in, the empires dissolved, the statesmen of that era reduced to names in textbooks. The liabilities they created, however, became the foundation of a new system. Somewhere in an archive, ledgers from that time still exist. They list loans extended, interest paid, defaults recorded. They are dry documents, austere and silent. Yet behind each entry lies a fragment of the human story. A factory worker whose wages eroded with inflation, a soldier who never returned from the front, financed by bonds, a family whose savings vanished with a currency reform. It is in this sense that the war was underwritten long before it was fought, and that its echoes continue in the financial structures within which the world still moves.